Welcome to the Real Clear Politics Takeaway for Friday, April 9th. I'm Andrew Walworth. April 15th is right around the corner, so many of us are already thinking about taxes. But this spring, there is a special reason to talk about them, as President Biden has proposed new tax measures that, in his view, will fundamentally reshape the American economy. This week, his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, announced an ambitious plan to seek global cooperation on corporate tax rates. Meanwhile, New York is set to run its own fiscal experiment, raising taxes on individuals and corporations. Life in New York City has already slowed down due to the pandemic, and we'll see if people are willing to pay higher taxes for the privilege of working in the Big Apple. Overall, Biden and the Democratic Party are making a huge political bet that the American public is with them on this, and that in the wake of a pandemic that devastated many people's financial lives, voters will embrace higher taxes and a larger role for government. Joining me to sort through all of this are co-founder and president of RealClearPolitics, Tom Bevan, White House correspondent Phil Wegmann, and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, former chief economist of the Council on Economic Advisors, and former head of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Tom, let me start with you, and I want to jump right to the politics of this. What do you make of this idea that Biden is betting that Americans are ready to accept higher taxes and more government in the wake of the pandemic? And if that's the bet he's making, is he right?
Yes, I think broadly speaking, and that's, we've had crises in public life before, and there does seem to be a shift where the public turns toward government for solutions. It happened after the 2008 financial crisis. I think people are looking to the government for solutions on COVID. I think more specifically, he's betting on the notion that the public supports higher taxes on corporations, right? And if you believe in the polling data, they do. But, the question is whether that is going to first be possible. And it doesn't look like, from what I've seen and heard, that he's going to be able to get the hike that he wants, right, all the way to 28. It's going to be something less than that, most likely. And then, what are the consequences of that? I mean, obviously, the economy is front and center along with COVID in the minds of the public. And we did have some great unemployment numbers. It looks like we're, going to come out of this thing with some good growth. And the question is this policy going to in any way slow the growth and sort of, retard any recovery? Biden says it won't happen. He said the other day, there's no evidence to support this, and this will actually help create jobs. I think Doug and maybe some other Doug could speak to this, but I think a lot of folks think that's flat out wrong, and that this will have some adverse effects on the economy.
Doug, we've seen this script before. Politicians like George Herbert Walker Bush, Walter Mondale, they paid a political price for either raising taxes or even just talking about it in the case of Mondale. Are we seeing that political calculation change?
I worked for H.W. Bush as well as W, and we've seen this movie before, as you said. What I find mystifying about this is imagine it's 2015, and we are in the midst of several years in a row of major American corporations deciding to relocate abroad. Each time there's just a political furor. The Treasury madly issues regulations to try to control it. The firms get accused of being Benedict Arnold firms, and Chuck Schumer and Rob Portman put together a working group that concludes that the U.S. is out of line because its corporate rate is too high, way out of line for the developed country competitors, and we tax companies on the basis of their worldwide income. And this has got to change. And in 2017, what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did on the corporation front was lower the rate and move toward a more territorial system where you get taxed on what you make in the U.S. and less outside. This is a complete U-turn. It goes right back to 2015, where we decided that we were out of step with reality. And so I find it mystifying that they are now saying this is going to fix our problems. This was our problem. And the addendum that they've come up with is, okay, this probably is a problem. So let's get Janet Yellen to convince everyone else to tax themselves more heavily so that we're not out of line. And good luck with that. I don't think that's going to work.
So, Phil, you're at the White House these days. We all see you on Twitter now. It's fun to watch your daily jousts with the press secretary there. Biden has already sort of signaled a willingness to compromise on the corporate tax rate, at least. What is the White House strategy here?
White House strategy is that they believe that that polling is going to see them through in the end of the day. There's support for increasing taxes on individuals who are making more than $400,000. There's support for increase on taxes of corporations, and everyone likes infrastructure. That's their argument. There seems to be a little bit of a fraying, though, as we see more and more details from the president's infrastructure proposal, given that while the public broadly supports the idea of roads and bridges, the administration is finding themselves now having to sell an infrastructure package that does much, much more than that. And so the hope of the administration right now is they want to get this through. They see this, as a jobs program, even if sort of only the skeleton has to do with roads and bridges. But look, I mean, the staffers that I'm dealing with over at the White House, these are our 20 and 30-year-olds who grew up not during the Clinton era, certainly not Reagan or the first Bush. Instead, the sort of moment that defines their consciousness is the Great Recession. They lived through the Obama years, and so their default, their knee-jerk reaction is always more and with urgency.
Doug, is that true?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that even in the economics profession, as we've seen the sort of next generations come in, get trained up, there's a far greater willingness to deviate from the so-called neoliberal consensus of hands-off private markets and a minimal footprint for the government. That's not their default. I was trained that you first demonstrate that the private sector can't do it, then you demonstrate that the government can do it, and only when those two things are true do you put some responsibility in the federal government. And that the default now is, let's have the federal government do it, and we'll see how it works out. So it's a very different worldview.
Well, Doug, since you mentioned changing ideas about taxes, I'm going to make a shameless plug for a new documentary series called The Unauthorized History of Taxes that we just finished for Fox. And Doug, you play a prominent role in the film, as you know, and it tries to give the viewer a historical context for the debate we're having now on taxes. So a 1-hour version airs this Sunday night on Fox at 10 p.m. Whole series is available on Fox Nation, which is their digital subscription channel. Brett Baer is the host. I hope you'll tune in. So that is my plug for my own show. But Tom, let's get back to the Senate, where Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, has spoken out against parts of this tax plan. And he is, of course, a key person in a 50-50 divided Senate. What's going to happen with Joe?
I don't know. I mean, he's been very forceful, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, gave an interview to CNN where he said, look, I'm not interested, will not in any way do anything to kill the filibuster. He couldn't be more clear on that point. He also said that, reconciliation, he said there's a time and a place for it, but it shouldn't be the main vehicle for them to move the agenda. And as we know, Chuck Schumer, got this ruling from the Senate parliamentarian that they can take another bite at using reconciliation for the infrastructure plan. And now he's looking at trying to figure out how to shoehorn his way into immigration reform via reconciliation, some of these other things. And so it seems like, Joe Manchin's a little bit reticent to just be on that train. He also reiterated his calls for bipartisanship and wanting and needing, compromise. Now, he said that about the COVID relief plan. No Republicans voted for it. It went through anyway. He was on board with that. But maybe now, after that, that he's going to actually, sort of practice what he preaches in terms of making sure that Republicans get on board with, whatever it takes. If to the point, if the infrastructure plan needs to be pared down, and some of this stuff needs this extraneous stuff that the administration is now calling infrastructure, right? The caring infrastructure and all this stuff gets stripped away. Then you could see perhaps some Republicans getting on board. Again, the question will end up being, how do we pay for it? But at the end of the day, that's something that maybe, because I think there's broad agreement that, we could use some new roads and bridges and, our airports could be updated and all that stuff. So Joe Manchin is sort of, at the moment, positioned as the sort of skunk of the garden party for the Democrats. He's going to If he stays true to what he says, it's going to be tough for them to just jam through this agenda as Chuck Schumer and some of the folks on the left apparently want to do. That's going to put him under an inordinate amount of pressure. But, as I was talking about this the other day, I mean, Joe Manchin of all the senators might be best positioned to handle that pressure because he is his own brand, even though he comes from a heavily Republican state. Voters there know him. He has a lot of history with them. He's in a position to tell the progressive wing of his party to go take a hike and pound sand. And he's also, it'll be interesting to see how the Democrats handle him, because I think they have to be careful. They don't want to alienate him. They don't want to pressure him by calling him a racist for not wanting to do away with the filibuster, or calling him, all these sort of names, using the tactics that they use against Republicans, because that might end up, in one scenario, making him a Republican, and that wouldn't be very good for the Democrats. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But he is King Joe right now.
Doug, you're a pretty good student of the Congress. You've worked up there. How do you view it?
I think the notion that they're going to get another bite at the reconciliation apple's too optimistic. The parliamentarian didn't say no, but also didn't say anything more than yes, there is a provision for a revision to the budget resolution, and it can contain reconciliation instructions. Didn't say anything about the scope of that. Didn't say anything about just what constitutes a revision versus something out of whole cloth. And so that's I think, going to look less and less appealing to Schumer as time goes on. And if they get to the point where they need to get something done, we're going to see the infrastructure plan and the American family plan, yet to be announced details, merge into a single reconciliation bill that moves late in the year. And I still think that's the most likely forecast, and that gives them a lot of time to collect the Democratic Party and try to get on one page. That's the real problem now. They are not. Their problem is not Republicans. It is in the House even. They don't have a consensus. In the Senate, they don't have a consensus. They can all look at Joe and blame him, but they have bigger problems, and they got to work that out.
Doug, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Is it so if they bundle those two things together, which will take it from $2 trillion to probably $4 trillion?
Yep.
Doesn't that make it less likely to pass? That is a big number to try and get through.
You won't get any Republicans. The only way you get it through is strictly, reconciliation, straight Democratic vote, the same way the American Rescue Plan went through, and it gives you some additional revenue. They have had on their list raise the top rate on the individual side, tax capital gains more heavily at death and during people's lives. The price, the pharmaceutical price controls they have in mind get you $400 or $500 billion as well. So that allows them, to get rid of the infrastructure fiction, right? They're just we now are going to take care of families and the jobs, and here we go. And they can pare back the corporate provisions as a result, because they know in their heart of hearts they can, quote, get away with it, because right now there's so much money on the sidelines that the moment the virus disappears, the economy's going to grow no matter what they do. In that moment, when you raise the corporate rate, it's going to look harmless. It's going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now when again, we're going to see this sort of poor economic growth, headquarters deciding to go somewhere else, loss of jobs, and they'll realize that was a policy error. But they can get it through right now, and so they probably will. The real change that's happened in the profession, just to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the biggest change in the economics profession is the willingness to raise rates. I was trained. Yes, you will need more revenue in your life, and we need more revenue right now. I think that's a reality. The way you do it is you broaden the base as much as possible, have the tax code be as neutral as possible, raise rates as a last resort. It's the first resort now. Let's go get people. Let's go get corporations. Let's go get individuals. And that's a very different mindset.
So I want to talk about New York, talking about a different mindset. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. New York is going to, the plan announced this week, they're going to raise income taxes for New York residents. It'll make New York City the highest tax jurisdiction in terms of income in the country. New rate for high earners in the city is 14.8%. That eclipses California, which is at 13.3%, which used to be the highest. And just a reminder that in Florida, that rate is 0. So, Tom, people vote with their feet Are we going to just see further exodus from New York? And to Doug's point, I mean, what are these guys thinking? I got to say, I do research before these shows, believe it or not. No one seems to be for this other than Cuomo and a couple guys up in Albany.
Yeah, I mean, it is astonishing, and it will continue the exodus to Florida and Tennessee and Texas and other places. Especially, I think when New York City, there's a certain allure to being there. Pre-pandemic, there was, right? Because you had great restaurants, you had Broadway, you had all this stuff. You no longer have any of that. It's, and it's going to take a while for that to come back. And in the meantime, it's been replaced by, homeless people and, skyrocketing crime rates and, all sorts of stuff. New York City has sort of lost its allure. And so why are people going to stay there and pay these inordinate sort of confiscatory tax rates when they can go now to Florida or someplace else? And we've all, read the stories about how businesses have adapted and people are conducting business from wherever now. We have the same issue in Illinois. I mean, we have, J.B. Pritzker, our governor, wanted to jam through a progressive, tax scheme, and voters rejected it. And so it's put a little crimp in his plans. But I mean, it's always they need more money. Our rates here are our property tax rates, our sales tax rates are very, very high. And, the city's a mess, the state's bankrupt. And the question is, well, why are we, and the weather's great, so why are we living here, right? But the government just always needs more money. And it is always, to Doug's point, it's now the sort of default position to turn to corporations and high earners and say, you are not paying your fair share. You must pay more. Because we have these inequities. And it puts these states in sort of a death spiral. I mean, the exodus from Illinois is real. Property values were going down. Because people are leaving the state and with crime rates going up, it makes it hard to turn around once you get into that sort of death spiral. And there are a few states that are struggling with it right now, and they happen to be all blue.
Well, Phil, you're young and an urbanite. Defend this. Is there a price you're willing to pay to live in these great cities, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco?
You're asking me to defend these massive millennial towers of decadence, these sky rises where everyone spends about a third or more of their paycheck on rent to live in this condominium. And oh, by the way, it comes with a rooftop pool, but that's okay because you're going to be young forever. I don't know if I can do it. I was gonna tell Tom to move to the greatest state in the union, which is my home, Indiana. You should move over to Indianapolis. But look, I think that what's interesting is you talk to the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings who are here in D.C., and they are very much in the moment. They have come to the consensus in their mind that limited government does not work, that tax cuts do not work, that the free market is not their friend. And this is a creeping sort of mindset that is also infecting younger policy staffers on the right as well. There's much more of an appetite for people who call themselves conservatives to turn to the federal government to solve a lot of these problems. And it's interesting that there seems to be an appetite, perhaps not for more taxation, but certainly an appetite to go after corporations. Interestingly enough, with some of the culture war stuff, you had Georgia pull Delta's tax cuts on jet fuel. Texas was thinking about doing something similar. McConnell even sort of issued the shot across the bow where he was like, hey, corporations, try not to meddle. That would be bad if you were a woke parallel government. But then he had to immediately walk it back sort of the next day. The reason being is that there's this tension, at least on the right, where some people want to rein in corporations, but then at the same time, they're fighting against an increase in that corporate tax rate. I think it's interesting that at a moment when on the left you have much more of an appetite for big government, for taxes being increased, that there is not a standard bearer on the right after the Trump years where we saw a debt and deficit balloon to sort of stand athwart all of this and shout no.
Doug, is there a champion out there for tax cuts? And as far as the deficit, it does seem that the Republicans have rediscovered fiscal responsibility and have revived their opposition to deficit spending after years of not worrying about it at all.
They're talking about it, but there's no genuine fiscal responsibility on either side of the aisle right now. I mean, that's just impossible to defend. So there isn't a champion at the moment. The Republican Party is a mess. It's deeply divided. The populist wing doesn't have any policies because they don't need to have to figure out what principles they have and what policies flow from them. They give the people what they want, and then they use the tools of government to do it. And so there has not yet emerged a modern voice for traditional conservative principles and policies. And that's something that either will happen or those will go away. I mean, because they need a defender at the moment.
Doug, I'm interested in your take on what Phil was saying, which is there is this increasing hostility among Republicans toward corporations, particularly these, Coke and Delta and Gillette and Nike and all these companies that have come out to be sort of woke. And we've run a few pieces on Real Clear Politics, but we're seeing it more and more, as part of the commentary and the culture, which is people say, look, Donald Trump has fundamentally changed the Republican Party. It's now a party of, blue-collar workers. It's no longer a white-collar party. That's now the parties have switched places, right? And now Democrats are the ones who are, filling the C-suites around the country and in Silicon Valley and the like. Do you agree with that characterization? And what do you think the political ramifications of that are?
We have seen an increasing disconnect. I mean, think back prior to the election, you have the Chamber of Commerce announcing they're not going to exclusively support Republicans, right? And essentially say, by implication, you have not delivered. You're not able to govern effectively, and we've got to get someone who can. And so that rift starts there. Trump's behavior post-election exacerbates everything. And you get these announcements that we're cutting off money to Republicans who defended the president on this, and then you get shots fired back by McConnell, and it's now a real issue. I mean, there's a lot of tension there, and neither side knows what to make of the other, and that's because there are really two Republican parties at the moment, and they can't agree, and the business community is caught in the middle, and they see no reason why they need to be, and so I don't see this sort of going back to its previous incarnation quickly, and I don't see them aligning automatically with Democrats either, because there's a whole lot there that they're looking at right now and thinking, oh my, no, we can't do this. So the business community is really, I think, quite caught in the middle at the moment, and they do not know what to do.
Is that a bad thing for Republicans, though, to be not seen as sort of the party of corporations? I mean, Mitt Romney famously said, corporations are people, my friend.
So I'll just voice my frustration, which I've only had for about 40 years, which is, you shouldn't be for corporations. The whole point of good economic policy is to have people do well, and corporations are a vehicle to the well-being of the people. And there's nothing particularly interesting about corporations per se, in my view. And it's always troubled me that Republicans so quickly say, oh, we're going to defend business and we're going to defend corporations. They also defend small business like they're sacred. And none of any of that makes any sort of coherent intellectual sense. But that's where they've been for a long time.
Herb Stein, the great economist, said a trend that can't continue won't,
Yep.
I think was basically. So, where does this movie end? I mean, can we keep running these deficits? Can we keep spending and spending and printing and printing? And
Nope. No. You can't. So this can't go on forever. I mean, there's no question about that. It's already, in my view, taking its toll. The whole point of the massive borrowing is not the fact that interest rates are low or you like to borrow. It's that you want to take command of resources and use them in the ways the government wants, not the private sector. You could do it by taking it with taxes. You can do it by taking it with borrowing. It doesn't matter. The whole point is we want to get a hold of that worker and tell them to erect solar panels instead of going out and doing something else. Right? That's the game. So when you do that, you give up something. And in the numbers, private sector investment's about a 10% rate of return. An infrastructure investment's about a 5% rate of return. So as you move the stuff across the line from the private sector to the government, you give something up. But it's not dramatic. Like, $1, it's 5 cents. In a year, you don't notice it. But over time, cumulatively, this is sapping our capacity to increase the standard of living. It's why real wages don't go up. It's why everyone gets frustrated with our overall performance. And so we've already paid a toll for it, and we will continue to pay a toll, and it will increase. Everyone thinks that there's no cost because there's not a crisis. I can't tell you how many people say, oh, look at Japan, it's all fine. Do you want to be Japan? Do you want to go from the second largest economy on the globe to a non-entity? No, you don't. That's a D. So we're paying a price, and we should recognize we're paying that price and sort of come to our senses. But it's going to take a while.
So, Phil, it does seem like there are these two trends right now that I see. We come out of these crises with a bigger government and higher taxes to pay for it. At the same time, the laws of economics have not been repealed. And if anything, certain trends have been accelerated, including what we've been just talking about, which is that money is more mobile than ever. People, corporations, the global economy, it is easier to move your stuff someplace else where you get to keep more of your stuff. When you look at this, Phil, what do you see the sort of end game here?
Oh, well, you won't be able to move your money to the Cayman Islands or to the Bahamas once the global minimum tax rate is finally enacted, right? Because that's going to happen. I think that what we're seeing is that there were a lot of warnings about inflation, about debt and deficit in 2010. And that was what Republicans harped about during the Obama years. Like we've said earlier in this podcast, once they got into power, that all went out the window. And so you have a White House and an administration which does not care at all about the arguments coming from reawakening fiscal conservatives. They heard it during the Obama years. They saw that it wasn't genuine during the Trump years. And there is a sentiment that, look, since the 1970s, the chickens have not come home to roost when it comes to questions of inflation. And it was interesting. We were in the White House briefing room when Brian Deese's deputy, one of his deputies in the National Economic Council, had to stop himself because he said something inaccurate. He said, that this amount of funding, this amount of spending was permissible because, quote, interest rates are permanently low. And then he stopped himself and he said, well, we think that there are structural factors that will keep them very low for some time. This administration doesn't exactly believe in modern monetary theory, the idea that you can just spend your way out of trouble, but they're pretty darn close. And the reason why is they are seeing economics in terms of the last couple of decades. They're not seeing it in terms of centuries. They're saying, yeah, you said that we lived on this fault line for some type of economic earthquake that only occurs maybe once or twice a century. Well, nothing like that has happened within the last couple of decades. Therefore, we must be fine. And I don't think that until there's another crisis that mindset is going to change. And look, I think that as was alluded to earlier in the podcast, once we come out of the pandemic, there is going to be growth. There is also going to be an immediate sentiment, sort of this, moment of, wow, things are back to normal. And maybe the everyday person isn't saying, oh, well, there was only 1% GDP growth. Maybe the everyday person is just going to say, look, I'm back at work and I can see my family again. And so they might not pay attention to what Republicans or conservatives would say would be a looming crisis.
So, Doug, Phil mentions the Janet Yellen's plan to sort of set global tax rates for corporations that sort of regularize it, I guess, would be one way to look at it. Is that a fantasy? Is that possible even? And if you could, is it a good idea?
A, it's not a good idea. And B, it's going to be virtually impossible to pull off. You really are trying to create a cartel to fix tax prices, and cartels never stick together. There's always an incentive to cheat in a cartel, right? I'm just going to give you a disguised credit for locating jobs in my country. So you might have a rate out there somewhere, but the effective rates are going to bounce all around, and it's not going to happen. In the end, businesses don't care about taxes. Businesses don't care about worker trading, where they don't care about the infrastructure. They care about the value package they get. And if you can have a higher tax place that offers tremendous public services and a well-trained workforce, people will show up. And that's the New York problem. They're offering a bad value package and making it worse. That's been California's problem. All of public policy in California has been dedicated to the proposition that Utah needs to be a better state. So they just send people over the border. And they'll learn this in the White House, because what they're offering is an increasingly less valuable package. We'll raise your corporate rates, but we're not going to put the money into roads, bridges, and things that give you production value. We're going to expand Medicaid, and we're going to rehab some public housing, and good luck with that. I mean, they will walk. You can move in this world, and they will.
So, Tom, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to ask you the question, which has always occurred to me, which is that every time we talk about Illinois, you tell me what's wrong with Illinois. When are you going to vote with your feet?
Well, my daughter is a senior who graduates in about a month. So, and we've had, we've got 5 kids, and they're all in school, so there's never been a good time. But the window is opening, let's put it that way, and it will remain open for some period of time. So, look, we've been talking about it for years, and
I just want to point out that I was in D.C. when my daughter graduated from high school. I was commuting from Syracuse, New York, and she graduated, and I thought to myself, is there any reason for me to ever go back to Syracuse, New York? And the answer was no. You may find that.
Yeah. So,
Tom, I would like to put my plug in for Woodburn, Indiana. We have 1 stoplight, 2 bars, 3 churches, a good high school, low tax rate. So,
and there are a lot of Illinoisans that are moving, just across the border to Indiana, or they're moving to, just across the border to Wisconsin or to Iowa. And then there's the whole host of them that are moving to Nashville and to Austin and to, Tampa or something. It is a real problem. And, Richard Porter, who may actually run for governor, has argued, and he's written repeatedly for us, that given the constraints that we face here, that the only answer is for the state to declare bankruptcy. And for the federal, we have to, because federal law will trump state law, which is the problem with our state law is baked into the Constitution that you shall not diminish pensions. And we've never been able to get around that. It's something that both parties have, basically been part of, as John Cass likes to call it, the Illinois Combine, feeding at the trough for 40 years. And this is where we end up. So maybe that happens and we get to that point. But if we don't, I don't know how the state would turn it around because of just the dynamics that are in play. And it's a blue state. They keep electing the same people, right? Chicago's had a Democratic mayor for over 100 years. And even when they had Republican governors with a supermajority Democrats in the state legislature, there's just nothing that gets done. And so it's a real problem. And again, it's not unique to Illinois. We happen to be probably in the worst shape of almost any state in the country, but it's California, it's New York, it's other places as well. It's New Jersey. So I don't know how this movie ends, but it most likely does not end well.
Well, I think the headline coming out of this that Tom may be moving to warmer climes. So with that bit of news, we'll have to say goodbye. But I want to thank everyone, Doug Holtz-Eakin, Tom Bevan, and Phil Wegmann, my guests this week. This has been the Real Clear Politics Takeaway for Friday, April 9th. Again, tune in if you can, Sunday night, 10 p.m., Fox News, 1-hour documentary that Doug appears in, that I wrote and produced. So worth watching because it'll give you a little bit of historical perspective on topics we talked about today. And thank you for listening. For Real Clear Politics, I'm Andrew Walworth.